The folder was already on the table when my son-in-law walked in. I hadn't opened it yet. I just let it sit there, right next to the breadbasket, while everyone pretended not to notice it. My daughter poured wine. Her husband, whose name is Stufert, pulled out his chair slowly, like a man who already knew something was about to go wrong, but hadn't decided how to react yet. My grandson was upstairs asleep. The baby monitor sat on the kitchen counter, its little green light blinking steady and calm. I had driven 40 minutes to get here. I'd been to this house dozens of times. I helped pick it out, if I'm being honest. Not pick it out the way you browse Zillow on a Sunday afternoon. Pick it out the way you co-sign a mortgage when your daughter calls you crying. Because the interest rate went up again, and they were going to lose the one they wanted. That was 3 years ago. I remember sitting in the loan officer's office thinking, they'll be fine. They're young. Stuart has a good job. Naomi works hard. They'll grow into it. I told myself that the way you tell yourself a lot of things when you love someone and you don't want to see what's right in front of you. Let me back up, because there's a part of this that took me a long time to say out loud. My name is Beverly. Wait, no. I'd been called Bev my whole life, but I stopped letting people shorten it after I turned 62. That was the year I paid off my house, got promoted to senior compliance officer at the firm where I'd worked for 19 years, and decided that I had earned the right to be called by my full name. Lenora. That's who I am. Lenora. 66 years old, still working, still sharp, and apparently still the person my family calls when the numbers don't add up. My daughter Naomi is 34. She married Stuart 8 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than my first car, and I mean that literally. I still have the receipts because I paid for half of it. Stuart is an account manager at a tech firm. He makes good money. Naomi is in marketing, also good money. Together, the two of them bring in somewhere between $260,000 and $290,000 a year, depending on his bonus cycle. They have one child, Elliot. He's almost 2. Elliot is the best thing that has happened to this family in a decade, and I say that as a woman who has had some genuinely good decades. He has Naomi's eyes and Stuart's stubbornness, and when he laughs, it sounds like someone shaking a jar of buttons. I would do almost anything for that little boy. Almost. The phone call came on a Thursday in February. I was at my desk, finishing a compliance review when Naomi called. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she called 3 times in a row without leaving a message, which is what she does when something is wrong, but she doesn't know how to start the conversation. I picked up on the 4th call. She said, "Mom, we need to talk about something, all 3 of us. Can you come for dinner Saturday?" I said, "Sure." She said, "It's about your retirement. I want to tell you I had some premonition right then, that I felt something shift. But honestly, I thought she was asking about my 401eng. I'd mentioned a few months earlier that I was thinking about the timeline, starting to feel the edges of it. I thought maybe she was worried about me. I thought this was going to be a warm, concerned conversation over pasta. I was wrong. Saturday dinner was pot roast. Naomi makes good pot roast. The table was set nicely, the cloth napkins she only uses when she wants something to feel official without being awkward. Stuart had opened a bottle of red wine. Good bottle. Not their usual. I noticed that. We ate for a while and talked about nothing. The weather. A show they'd been watching. Elliot's new word, which was more, delivered at full volume whenever food was within his line of sight. At some point, Naomi put Elliot to bed and came back downstairs, and the energy in the room changed. Not dramatically. Just. The air went a little still. Stuart set down his fork. He said, "Lenora, we've been thinking a lot about our situation. With Elliot, with everything, and we think the best solution, the thing that makes the most sense for the whole family, is if you retired a little earlier than you planned." I looked at him. He kept going. Daycare is almost $2,000 a month. That's almost $24,000 a year. And with the mortgage and the cars and everything else, we're stretched really thin. And Elliot already knows you. He loves you. It would be better for him to be with someone who loves him rather than strangers. I picked up my wine glass. I said, "How much earlier are we talking?" Naomi said, "Like now, this spring." I put the glass back down. I'm 66. My plan, my actual, documented, financially structured plan, was to retire at 68. Not because I love compliance work, though I will say there is a particular satisfaction in finding the thing that doesn't match. But because at 68, between my pension, my Social Security timing, and my savings, I would be in a position to retire comfortably. At 66, I would be pulling from accounts I wasn't ready to pull from, and leaving money on the table I had spent 30 years putting there. I had done the math. I had a folder. I didn't open the folder that night. I said, let me think about it, which is something I say when what I actually mean is, I need 24 hours before I respond to something, because the first response that comes to my mouth is not always the right one. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The neighborhood was quiet. There was a dog barking somewhere down the block, and the sound of it just kept going, steady and ignored, like it had been doing this so long everyone had stopped hearing it. I thought about what Stuart had said. The mortgage, the cars, everything else, everything else. I pulled out my phone and opened a spreadsheet app I use for work sometimes when I need to think. I started typing from memory. Not their exact numbers, I didn't have those. But the estimates I'd absorbed over the years. The house payment I knew because I was on the loan. The cars. I'd seen them pull into my driveway enough times to know they were both new, both American-made SUVs, both the kind with the leather interior option and the packages. The country club membership. Stuart mentioned at Easter like it was nothing, just something they'd done. $1,200 a year, he'd said, though I later found out that was per month. The private preschool they'd enrolled Elliot in for the fall. Wait. I stopped typing. If Elliot was in preschool in the fall, the program they'd already told me about, the one that cost $5,000 a year, then why did they need someone to watch him full-time? I made a note in the margin of my mental spreadsheet. Just a little asterisk. Then I made another call. I want to be careful about how I tell this next part, because there is a version of it that makes me sound like I was investigating my own daughter, and that's not what it was. What it was a conversation with my sister-in-law Dottie, who lives 2 streets over from Naomi and Stuart, and who is the kind of woman who notices things. I called Dottie on Sunday morning and I said, "Have you seen who's been at Naomi's house on Tuesdays?" Dottie said, "You mean her mother-in-law? Gail." I said, "Yes." Dottie said, "She's there every Tuesday that I've seen. Gets there around 8:30, leaves mid-afternoon, has been for a while." I said, "Do you know if she gets paid for that?" There was a pause. Dottie said, "Honey, I wouldn't know that." I said, "Fair enough." I called Naomi that afternoon. I kept it casual. I said I'd been thinking about the arrangement, and I wanted to understand what the full picture looked like. I asked about Elliot's schedule. Naomi mentioned the preschool for the fall. I asked about Now, who was watching Elliot during the week. She hesitated just slightly. Then she said, "Stuart's mom comes on Tuesdays. We pay her a little something for gas and trouble. How much?" Another pause. "Not much. Like $100, I said. "Okay." I did not say, "I don't think that's true." Not yet. I spent the following 2 weeks the way I spend every problem I can't solve emotionally, methodically. I did not call Naomi to argue. I did not call Stuart to ask pointed questions. I went to my own records first. The mortgage. I had a copy because I was the co-signer. I pulled it out and looked at what they'd qualified for, what the monthly payment was, and what the refinance options would look like now that rates had shifted. Their original loan was a 5-year ARM. It was resetting in 7 months. When it reset, their payment would go from $3,100 a month to somewhere between $3,700 and $4,100, depending on the index at reset time. That was why they needed a refinance. And a refinance, in the current rate environment, with their existing debt load, would require my income on the application again. Because without my salary propping up the debt-to-income ratio, they would not qualify. So they needed 2 things from me. They needed me to retire, and they needed me to still be earning in order to refinance before I retired. I wrote that down. I circled it twice. Then I started on their expenses. I am not a snoop by nature. But I have spent 19 years in compliance, which means I am extremely good at reconstructing a financial picture from partial information. I knew the mortgage payment. I knew the HOA because it was on the original disclosure documents. I knew the car payments were likely somewhere between $800 and $1,100 a month combined, based on the model years and the financing norms for their credit range. I found their country club listed online. It was not $1,200 a year. The base membership was $1,400 a month. I looked at the daycare they'd mentioned. I actually called. $2,000 a month was accurate for the center near them, for full-time infant and toddler care. I added everything up. Their take-home after taxes on $260 to $290 was probably around $15,000 a month, give or take. Their fixed expenses, conservatively estimated, were right around $13,200. That left less than $2,000 a month for food, utilities, medical, clothing, anything else, which explained the stretch, which also meant the country club membership, at $1,400 a month, was the entire discretionary margin, and then some. They were not broke. They were spending like people who made significantly more than they made. There's a difference. I called my old friend from work, a woman named Cecile, who'd left the firm 2 years ago to do private financial consulting. I asked her to look over my numbers. She called me back the same evening. She said, "These are rough estimates, Lenora, but if they're even in the ballpark, your daughter and her husband have a spending structure that requires a continuous escalation of income or outside support to sustain." I said, "And if that outside support is me retiring early and watching Elliot full-time?" Cecil said, "Then you're essentially subsidizing the country club membership." I said, "Yeah, that's what I was afraid of." She said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I needed one more piece of information. I found out about Gail through a circuitous route that I am not going to walk through in detail because it involves a conversation with Naomi's neighbor that I'm not sure Naomi would want me to have had. But here is what I found out. Stuart's mother, Gail, watches Elliot every Tuesday. She has done this since Elliot was 9 months old. She is paid $800 a month to do it. Not $100 for gas and trouble, $800. Steady every month from an account in Naomi's name that Stuart does not have visibility into. I confirmed this the old-fashioned way. I asked Gail directly. I ran into her at a garden center, genuinely by accident, and I said, "Gail, I've been thinking about helping out with Elliot more. I want to make sure whatever I do works with what you're already doing." And then I just waited. Let the silence do its job. Gail said, "Well, Tuesday is my day, but the pay is good, so I'm not looking to give it up." I said, of course, that's fair." She said, "Naomi's been real good about it." $800 a month is more than fair for one day," I said. "That is fair." And I drove home, and I sat in my driveway again, and this time I stayed longer. I want to be clear about something. I was not angry at Gail, not even a little. Gail is a woman in her late 60s who does a full day's work watching a toddler and gets paid for it. She is doing exactly what a reasonable person does. I respected it. I was also not angry at Naomi in the way that the word angry usually means. What I felt was something older and quieter than anger. It was the feeling you get when you've been looking at something slightly sideways for a long time, and then you finally look at it straight on, and everything that confused you suddenly makes sense. And the clarity isn't a relief. It's a weight. They had been paying Stuart's mother $800 a month for years. They had asked me to do the same job. More days, actually, full-time, for free. And the reason they framed it as retirement was because retirement sounds like a gift. It sounds like an opportunity, like I'd be the lucky one, getting to slow down, spend time with my grandson, stop rushing around. But what they were actually asking was, will you give up 2 years of salary and pension growth so we can save on childcare, while we continue the country club membership and keep both new cars? The answer was no. The answer had always been going to be no. I just needed to know all of it first before I said it. I called Naomi and asked if we could do dinner again the following Saturday. She sounded relieved, like she thought I was calling to say yes. She made the pot roast again. The table was set the same way. Good wine. I brought the folder this time. It was a plain manila folder. I'd had it sitting on my passenger seat the whole drive over, and I carried it inside tucked under my arm, and I set it on the table next to my placemat, and I didn't say anything about it. Naomi glanced at it. Stuart glanced at it. Neither of them asked. We ate. We talked about Elliot. He was upstairs again. We talked about the weather. About a road trip they were planning for the summer, which, I noted mentally, also cost money. When Stuart poured the last of the wine, I put my hand on the folder. I said, I've done some thinking, and I want to talk through everything properly, because I want to make sure we're all working from the same picture. Stuart nodded in the way men nod when they think they've already won. I opened the folder. I had printed everything out. The mortgage documents, with the reset date circled. My estimated breakdown of their monthly expenses, organized by category, with the country club listed as its own line item. A printout of the daycare center's rates. A simple one-page summary at the back that I had written myself, titled, What's Being Asked of Me? I slid the expense breakdown across the table first. I said, I want to start with this. These are estimates. I don't have your exact numbers, but I've been doing this kind of work for 19 years, so I'm probably close. If anything's off, tell me, and we'll correct it. Naomi looked at the paper. Stuart looked at it. Neither of them said anything was off. I pointed to the country club line. I said, $1,400 a month is what the membership runs, correct? Stuart said, yeah, but it's a networking thing. It's for work, I said. I'm not asking you to justify it. I'm just making sure the number is right. He said it was right. I pointed to the cars. He said, we need 2 cars. I said, I know. I'm not saying otherwise. I'm just noting the payments. I slid the daycare printout across next. I said, $1,980 a month for full-time toddler care at the center near you. That's what they quoted me when I called. Naomi said, when did you call them? I said, last week. The table was quiet. I pulled out the last page, the summary. I'd kept it short, 3 bullet points. I read them out loud. First, retiring at 66 instead of 68 costs me approximately $60,000 to $70,000 in lifetime pension and Social Security value. That's real money that I cannot get back. Second, without my income on the application, the refinance doesn't qualify. Retiring before the refinance closes means the application collapses. I don't think you've run those numbers. Third, I've learned that Gail is compensated $800 a month for 1 day per week. I was being asked to provide full-time coverage at no cost. I set the paper down. I said, I love Elliot. I love both of you. But I'm not able to retire early, and I'm not able to do this for free. Those aren't negotiating positions. They're math. What happened next is something I've described differently depending on who I'm telling it to. To my friend, Cecile, I said Stuart got up and walked to the kitchen and stood there for a while and then came back. To my sister, I said Naomi cried, but not the kind of crying that's about guilt. The kind that's about something not going the way she planned. What I'll tell you now is all 3 of those things happened, and also the room went very quiet in a way that was different from the silence at the beginning of dinner. That silence had been waiting. This silence was processing. Eventually, Naomi said, why didn't you just say no 2 weeks ago? I said, because I didn't know enough to say it properly. I needed to understand the whole picture first. She said, you could have just said no. I said, maybe, but then we'd be having a different kind of fight. She was quiet. I said, I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came here because I'm part of this family, and I wanted us to actually look at what the situation is, not what we wish it was. Stuart said from the kitchen doorway, you brought a spreadsheet to dinner. I said, you brought a mortgage to my retirement. That landed, I heard him exhale. We talked for another hour and a half. It was uncomfortable for some of it. There were a few moments when I thought Naomi might say something she couldn't take back. She didn't. She's always been better than her worst instincts, my daughter. I raised her to be that way, not that I would say that in the moment. We talked about the country club. Whether it was actually generating the networking value Stuart claimed, or whether it had become a habit they'd stopped examining. We talked about the car payments and whether one of the SUVs made sense to refinance into something cheaper. We talked about the actual timeline for Elliot's preschool start date and what a bridge solution might look like for the 5 months between now and fall. We talked about Gail. That conversation was shorter and sharper than the others. Naomi said the payment to Gail was something they'd kept separate because she hadn't wanted to seem like she was favoring one grandmother's time over the other. She thought it would be hurtful. I said, "What would have been hurtful is if I'd retired early, rearranged my whole financial future, and found out 6 months later." She didn't say anything to that. I said, "I'm not asking you to stop paying Gail. I'm asking that if you want my time, you value it the same way." I didn't storm out. I didn't cry in my car on the way home, though I considered it. What I did was drive home at a reasonable speed, let myself into my house, make a cup of tea, and sit in the chair by the window, where I do most of my thinking. I thought about what 68 looks like if nothing changes. What 66 would have looked like if I'd said yes. I thought about Elliot, asleep in his room under the little blue blanket with the stars on it, completely unaware that the adults in his life had just spent an evening renegotiating over him like he was a line item. He is not a line item. He is the reason any of this matters. But he also deserves a grandmother who is not resentful, who is not burned out, who has not hollowed out her own future to fill in a gap that his parents are capable of addressing themselves, if they're willing to look at what they're spending and make different choices. That's the thing about being 66 and having spent the better part of 40 years managing other people's numbers. You know what a fixable problem looks like. You know the difference between "we can't afford this" and "we don't want to give anything up to afford this." Their problem was the second kind. 2 months later, they refinanced the house. I was still on the application, still employed. We'd agreed that I would stay through the close, and then we would revisit the conversation about the future in a way that was actually honest. They reduced the country club membership to a social tier that cost $400 a month instead of $1,400. Stewart said he'd run the numbers and the networking value wasn't there at the higher level anyway. I believe him, partly because he is not a dishonest man. He just needed someone to give him permission to admit something wasn't working. They found a part-time nanny share with the family 2 houses down who had a child the same age as Elliot. It cost them $900 a month instead of $2,000. The kids play together. Elliot apparently adores the other little girl, follows her around like she's invented something. I watch Elliot on Fridays now. No payment exchanged, because it's one day and it's my grandson and I want to. Gail still does Tuesdays. We have had coffee twice since all of this happened. She is a practical woman, and I like her. The folder is still on my desk. I don't know why I haven't put it away. Maybe because it reminds me of something I want to keep remembering. You can love someone and still bring the math. You can be a mother and still say, "These are the numbers. This is what's true, and love does not require me to pretend otherwise." My retirement date is still 68. I have earned that, and I intend to collect.